The summer air was thick with heat, pressing down on the quiet suburban streets like an invisible weight. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows through the neatly trimmed trees lining our neighborhood. A picturesque community where every house looked like a carbon copy of the next, white fences, well-manicured lawns, and the silent, ever-watchful eyes of the homeowners association. It was the kind of place that prided itself on order, on rules, on an unspoken understanding that everyone here belonged to a certain standard of living. But none of that mattered now. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my pulse pounding in my ears like a war drum. In the back seat, my daughter, Emily, lay limp, her small body convulsing in weak, sporadic tremors, her face pale as wax. The seatbelt barely held her upright as I stole frantic glances at her in the rearview mirror. Her breathing was shallow, erratic, each rise and fall of her chest sending a fresh wave of terror crashing through me. "Hold on, baby," I whispered, my voice cracking, my foot pressing harder against the gas pedal. "Just hold on a little longer." I had called 911 the moment she collapsed, my heart nearly stopping when I saw her tiny frame go rigid, her eyes rolling back before she crumpled onto the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. The dispatcher's voice had been calm, methodical. "Help was on the way, just stay with her, keep talking to her." But every second that passed felt like a lifetime. I had no choice but to meet the ambulance halfway, praying that shaving off even a minute could be the difference between life and death. I veered onto Elmwood Drive, my tires screeching against the pavement as I made the sharp turn. And then I saw it. A black SUV was parked directly across the entrance to the main road, blocking the only way out of the neighborhood. A woman stood beside it, arms crossed, her expression twisted in a mask of self-righteous indignation. Karen. Of course, it was her. Karen Marshall, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association. A woman who wielded power like a weapon, enforcing every ridiculous rule with an iron fist. She was the type who sent letters about garbage cans being 2 inches too far from the curb, who lectured children for riding bikes on sidewalks, who had once threatened to call the police on a neighbor's son for looking suspicious while delivering newspapers. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ambulance's sirens were faint but growing louder in the distance. And yet here she was, standing in my way as if this were just another trivial neighborhood dispute. I threw open my door and practically leapt out. "Move your car," I shouted, my voice hoarse with panic. "My daughter needs help." Karen didn't flinch. If anything, she looked annoyed, like I had just interrupted her from something more important than the life of a child. She raised an eyebrow and tilted her head slightly, feigning confusion. "Excuse me? You do realize this is a private road, right?" I stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? My daughter is in the car. She's not breathing properly. The ambulance is coming." She sighed dramatically, glancing at her perfectly manicured nails before looking back at me with a condescending smirk. "And yet, you're speeding through here like a maniac. There are rules in this neighborhood, and I will not tolerate reckless driving, emergency or not." My hands clenched into fists. I could hear the ambulance now, closer, but still not close enough. Every second wasted on this conversation was another second Emily didn't have. "Get the way," I said, enunciating every word through gritted teeth. Karen folded her arms. "Not until we talk about this properly. You know, it's really quite irresponsible to." I didn't wait for her to finish. I turned back to my car, my mind racing, trying to find another way around, but there was no other exit. This was it. I could try driving through the yards, but the fences would slow me down. I could confront her directly, but she was the kind of woman who would scream assault the moment I so much as stepped too close. And then, as if the universe had reached its breaking point, the wailing sirens came to a stop just behind me. The ambulance had arrived. 2 paramedics jumped out before the vehicle had fully stopped, their eyes scanning the scene with practiced urgency. I pointed frantically at my car. "She's in the back. She just collapsed. Please." One of them rushed toward Emily while the other turned to me. "What happened?" She was fine this morning. And then she started getting dizzy. And then My voice broke as I struggled to form words. I don't know, please, just help her. Behind me, Karen scoffed. Well, maybe if some people would follow the community guidelines, we wouldn't have all this chaos. The paramedic turned sharply toward her. Ma'am, move your vehicle now. Karen bristled. I don't appreciate your tone. Move it, or we call the police for obstruction of emergency services. The color drained from her face. For the first time, she looked uncertain. She glanced between me, the paramedics, and the ambulance before huffing loudly, as if she were the victim in all of this. With exaggerated reluctance, she climbed into her SUV and reversed just enough to let the ambulance pass. I didn't even look at her. I was already at the back of the ambulance, watching as the paramedics worked on Emily, their hands moving in swift, coordinated precision. One of them inserted an IV, while the other placed an oxygen mask over her delicate face. Her pulse is weak, one of them muttered. We need to get her to the hospital. Now. I climbed in without hesitation, barely registering the slamming of the doors behind me. The ambulance lurched forward, sirens blaring once again as we sped toward the nearest hospital. As I held Emily's small hand in mine, watching the rise and fall of her chest under the oxygen mask, I felt a mix of emotions so intense they threatened to consume me. Fear, rage, helplessness. But above all, I felt something else. A deep, unrelenting hatred for the woman who had wasted precious seconds of my daughter's life over something as meaningless as community rules. And I knew with absolute certainty that I would never forgive her. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance cast eerie reflections on the pristine suburban houses as it screeched to a halt just outside the entrance to our neighborhood. The siren's wail had barely begun to fade when the driver slammed on the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a jarring stop. My heart, already racing from fear, nearly leapt out of my chest. I didn't understand why we had stopped. Not until I saw her. Karen Whitmore stood in the middle of the road, her arms crossed over her chest, her posture rigid with the unwavering confidence of someone who had spent years wielding authority over others. The streetlights cast sharp shadows on her face, accentuating the thin line of her lips pressed together in disapproval. Behind her, her massive black SUV was parked diagonally across the entrance to the neighborhood, a deliberate blockade that ensured no vehicle could pass without her say-so. I burst out of the ambulance before the paramedics could stop me, my entire body trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. Move your car, I shouted, my voice hoarse, raw from the panic clawing at my throat. My daughter is dying. Karen didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed irritated, as if my outburst was a minor inconvenience to her otherwise peaceful evening. She adjusted the pearl necklace around her throat and lifted her chin slightly. This is a private community, David, she said, her voice laced with condescension. You know the rules. Emergency vehicles are not allowed to speed through here unless authorized by the HOA. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Behind me, Emily lay motionless in the ambulance, her tiny frame barely moving under the oxygen mask. One of the paramedics leaned over her, checking her pulse, while the other began preparing medical equipment. Every second wasted here was a second stolen from my daughter's life. This isn't about your damn rules, I yelled, taking a step closer. She needs to get to the hospital now. Get out of the way. Karen sighed, shaking her head as if I were an unruly child throwing a tantrum. I don't make exceptions, David. If I did it for you, I'd have to do it for everyone. Do you know what would happen if we allowed ambulances to speed through here all the time? It would disrupt the peace of the neighborhood, lower property values, and create a dangerous precedent. We have policies in place for a reason. My vision blurred with rage. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. My hands clenched into fists at my sides as I fought the overwhelming urge to shove past her, to grab her by the shoulders and shake her until she understood that she was standing between my child and survival. One of the paramedics stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, this is a medical emergency. If you don't move your vehicle, you will be charged with obstruction of emergency services. Karen exhaled sharply through her nose. If he needed an ambulance, he should have filled out the proper emergency access paperwork in advance, she said, her gaze flicking toward me with a look of thinly veiled disgust. That's the procedure. He knows this. I could barely breathe. My whole body felt like it was shutting down from sheer helplessness. Are you serious right now? I rasped. My daughter is dying, Karen. She is dying. And you're talking about paperwork. She pursed her lips. The rules exist to protect us all. The paramedic didn't waste another second. He turned back toward the ambulance, motioning for his partner to prepare Emily for transport. Screw this, he muttered under his breath. We'll carry her out if we have to. I was already running. I jumped into the back of the ambulance, reaching for Emily just as one of the paramedics unfastened her stretcher. Her skin was cold, too cold. The beeping from the heart monitor was getting weaker. My fingers trembled as I touched her cheek, willing her to stay with me, to fight. Hold on, baby, I whispered. Please hold on. Karen's voice rang out behind me, still lecturing, still oblivious to the weight of what was happening. I will be reporting this to the HOA board, you know, she said. This kind of reckless behavior cannot. Move your damn car. The voice that interrupted her wasn't mine. It was the paramedic's, and this time, there was no patience left in it. His face, which had remained calm and professional up until this point, was now filled with something dangerously close to fury. He took a single step toward Karen, his gloved hands clenched at his sides. You are impeding emergency medical care. If you don't move your vehicle right now, we will call the police and you will be arrested. Do you understand me? For the first time, Karen hesitated. Her eyes darted between the paramedic, me, and the ambulance. She opened her mouth, closed it, then let out an exaggerated huff. Fine, she snapped, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. But I will be filing a complaint about all of this. The lack of decorum. I didn't hear the rest. The moment she stepped away, the ambulance roared to life, jerking forward as the driver took the first opening he could. I barely had time to grab onto the railing before we sped through the neighborhood, sirens wailing once more. As we raced toward the hospital, I kept my hands on Emily's, whispering her name over and over again like a prayer. The paramedic worked frantically beside me, adjusting the oxygen, checking her pulse, his expression unreadable. I didn't know if we had wasted too much time. I didn't know if those extra few minutes, the minutes Karen had stolen from us, would cost my daughter her life. But I did know one thing. If Emily survived, I would make damn sure that woman never held an ounce of power over anyone ever again. The hospital emergency room was a battlefield of urgency, a place where time became both an enemy and a lifeline. The moment the ambulance screeched to a halt, the back doors were thrown open, and the paramedics leaped into action. Emily was lifted from the stretcher with swift, practiced efficiency, her fragile body nearly weightless in their arms. I stumbled after them, barely able to keep up as they rushed through the automatic doors, my vision blurred with panic. The beeping machines, the sterile scent of antiseptic, the hurried footsteps of nurses. It all crashed over me in a dizzying wave of sensory overload, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was Emily. She wasn't responding. Her tiny chest barely moved beneath the oxygen mask, her face pale against the stark white of the hospital sheets. My mind clung to the desperate hope that if I kept my eyes on her, if I just willed her to stay, she wouldn't slip away. A nurse placed a firm hand on my shoulder, guiding me back as the trauma team descended upon her like a storm. I wanted to fight, to stay by her side, but my feet refused to move forward. Sir, we need you to step back, a doctor said, her voice firm but not unkind. Let us work. I stood there, helpless, watching through the glass as they attached wires to Emily's frail body, and 4 inserted into her arm, machines lighting up with numbers and signals I couldn't understand. My breath came in ragged gasps. A terrible weight pressed against my chest, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to demand they fix this, to rewind time and erase the minutes we had lost arguing with that heartless woman. Karen, The thought of her name sent a fresh wave of fury through me. Those wasted minutes could have made all the difference. What if they had cost Emily her life? My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. I had never hated anyone more than I hated Karen in that moment. A voice broke through the chaos. "David!" I turned to see my sister, Michelle, rushing toward me. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. She must have gotten my frantic call on the way here. The moment she reached me, she grabbed my arm, searching my face for answers. "Where is she? What happened?" I opened my mouth, but my throat felt like sandpaper. "They're working on her," I managed to croak, nodding toward the room where Emily lay. Michelle's gaze followed mine, and she inhaled sharply. "Oh God!" We stood there in silence, neither of us willing to voice the worst-case scenario that hung between us. I felt her fingers tighten around my arm, grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't the only one barely holding it together. Minutes passed like hours. Every muffled word from the doctors felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I could see one of them pressing down on Emily's tiny chest, a rhythmic motion that sent ice through my veins. Then, suddenly, the machines let out a piercing wail. The doctor's voice turned urgent. "She's coding. Get the crash cart." Everything inside me shattered. "No, no, no," I whispered, stepping forward before Michelle yanked me back. The doors burst open as more nurses rushed in. A defibrillator was wheeled beside the bed, paddles placed against my baby's chest. "Clear." Emily's small body jerked from the shock, then fell still again. The machine let out another long, dreadful beep. Again, another jolt. Silence. Couldn't breathe. The world had narrowed to that single sound, or rather, the absence of it. Then, finally, a weak, stuttering beep. "She's back," the doctor said, exhaling heavily. "We got her back." My legs nearly gave out. I braced myself against the wall, sucking in shaky breaths as the room around me spun. Michelle was crying beside me, but I barely heard her. All I could do was stare at my daughter's fragile form, her chest now rising and falling in slow, uneven movements. She was still unconscious, but she was alive. The doctor turned toward me. "She's stable for now, but it was close. Her oxygen levels were dangerously low when she arrived." Another few minutes. She trailed off, but I understood what she wasn't saying. Another few minutes, and she wouldn't have made it. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. My fists clenched at my sides, my nails biting into my palms. Those minutes had been stolen from us. Stolen by that woman and her damned rules. Karen had almost killed my daughter, and I would make sure she faced the consequences. The weight of exhaustion settled deep into my bones, but I refused to let sleep take me. I sat motionless beside Emily's hospital bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, as if the sheer force of my gaze could ensure that she would keep breathing. The monitors beeped in steady intervals, a sound that had once filled me with terror, but now felt like the sweetest music I had ever heard. The worst was over. She was still here, and yet, the rage inside me refused to fade. Karen's face, with its tight-lipped smugness and the cold certainty that she was in the right, haunted my thoughts. She had nearly cost my daughter her life over nothing more than some arbitrary neighborhood rule. Those precious minutes she had stolen from us could have been the difference between Emily waking up in this hospital bed or never waking up at all. My hands curled into fists as the memory of her voice rang in my head, sharp, dismissive, utterly devoid of empathy. A soft, rustling sound pulled me back to the present. Emily stirred slightly, her tiny fingers twitching against the blanket. My heart clenched as I leaned forward, my hand gently closing over hers. Her skin was warm, her pulse steady. She was going to be okay. The doctors had assured me of that, but I still needed to see it, to feel it, to convince myself that this nightmare wasn't going to take her from me. The door creaked open, and I glanced up, expecting to see a nurse or Michelle coming back with coffee. Instead, it was Karen. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She stood just inside the doorway, her usual confident posture noticeably absent. She looked smaller now, her shoulders hunched, her fingers twisting the strap of her designer handbag. Her face was pale, and for the first time since I had met her, there was no trace of arrogance in her eyes, only uncertainty. "I heard she made it," she said softly. Her voice lacked its usual sharpness, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to speak at all. I exhaled slowly, forcing my hands to relax. "She did." Karen nodded, her gaze flickering toward Emily. She took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, gripping the strap of her bag tighter. She swallowed. "I never meant for this to happen." I let out a bitter laugh. "But it did." Her face crumpled slightly, and she looked away. "I was just following the rules." Something in me snapped. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "Rules?" I hissed, barely keeping my voice low enough so I wouldn't wake Emily. "Your rules nearly killed my daughter. You stood there and watched as we begged for help, as we wasted time arguing while she was dying in my arms. And you?" My throat tightened, cutting off the words before they turned into something uglier. I ran a hand over my face, forcing myself to breathe. Karen flinched but didn't argue. "I know," she whispered. "I know I was wrong." Silence stretched between us. For so long, I had imagined what I would say to her if I ever got the chance. I had played out scenarios in my head where I screamed at her, where I made her feel the same helplessness she had forced me to endure. But standing here, in this hospital room, with Emily safe and breathing beside me, all I felt was exhaustion. "I don't care what happens to you," I said finally, my voice flat. "I don't care if they fire you, if the whole neighborhood turns against you, if you have to deal with lawsuits for the next 10 years. That's your problem. The only thing that matters to me is that you understand this. No rule, no regulation, no HOA policy is more important than a human life. If you had just taken a second to think instead of hiding behind your authority, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." Karen's eyes were damp, but she didn't wipe at them. Instead, she nodded. "You're right." I hadn't expected her to say that. She let out a shuddering breath. "I won't ask you to forgive me. I just needed to say I'm sorry." I studied her for a long moment, trying to find any sign that this was just another performance, another excuse. But there was none. She looked defeated, remorseful in a way that went beyond embarrassment or fear of consequence. She truly regretted what she had done, and yet, regret wouldn't erase the damage. "I don't need an apology," I said finally. "I needed you to make a different choice when it mattered." Karen nodded once more, then turned and left without another word. I sat back down, my body suddenly heavy with exhaustion. A tiny voice broke the silence. "Daddy." My breath caught as I turned to see Emily's eyes fluttering open, unfocused but bright. Relief crashed over me like a tidal wave. I leaned forward, brushing her curls back from her forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart." She blinked up at me, her lips curving into a weak smile. "You didn't leave." "Never," I whispered. "Not for a second." Her small fingers curled around mine, warm and alive. I felt my anger fade, replaced by something stronger. Something that had kept me fighting from the moment I saw her tiny, fragile body struggling for breath. Love. Because in the end, that was all that mattered. If you believe that compassion should always come before rules, that no authority should stand in the way of saving a life, share this story. Let's make sure this never happens again. Like, comment, and subscribe to spread the message.